1980 something. The snow is coming down more than it usually snowed in Washington State. I mean, that snow was piling up pretty high, 18 inches. And I'm riding in my dad's 1969 Ford, 390 cubic inches, Wes, fastback Ford. And we're going up this exit ramp, Cloverleaf, going up this hill. We're passing a cop that's stuck on the side of the road. One of the best days ever. We love police officers, but it was fun. But my dad said, son, I want you to be ready to jump out. And if the backside starts to slide, you push it back. He never did like me much. I thought, that's the strangest thing I've ever heard. You want me to jump out and push this back end in if it's sliding down in the snow? You know, sometimes we get requests. We hear things and we think, you know, that doesn't make any sense to me. That doesn't really compute. How is this actually going to work? And you know, sometimes in our spiritual walk, sometimes in our spiritual lives, we hear an idea, we hear something, we hear an instruction, and we think to ourselves, what good is that going to do? You know, in the book of Joshua, we see the story of the spies coming to Jericho. And we see the army of Israel walking around Jericho. And it's a great example to us about listening to God's instruction, even though it may not make sense to us. If you have your Bibles with you this morning, please turn to Joshua chapter 2. And there's actually a couple different parts to this story which are kind of interesting, but highly enlightening to us. Joshua chapter 2, notice what the text says. It says, then Joshua, the son of Nun, sent 2 men as spies secretly to Shittim, saying, go view the land, especially Jericho. So they went and came into the house of a harlot, a prostitute, whose name was Rahab, and lodged there. And it was told the king of Jericho, saying, behold, men from the sons of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land. And the king of Jericho sent word to Rahab, saying, bring out the men who have come to you, who have entered your house, for they have come to search out the land. And of course, she hides them on her roof. As we move forward in the story a little bit into verse 10, after the messengers of the king have left, Rahab is talking to the 2 spies. Notice verse 10. She says to them, we have heard now how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who are beyond the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. When we heard it, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in any man any longer because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. Now please swear to me by the Lord, since I have dealt kindly with you, that you also deal kindly with my father's house, and give me a pledge of truth. We move forward a little bit further in the story. Verse 17, the men said to her, we shall be free from this oath which you have made us swear, unless when we come into this land, you tie this cord of scarlet thread in the window through which you let us down. And gather to yourself and to your house your father, your mother, and your brothers, and all your father's household. Doesn't that seem kind of silly to you? That their message to this woman that has hidden them is, yeah, we'll spare you, but it's on this one condition, that you tie this little red thread in your window. What has that got to do with anything? But you see, they give her that instruction. Now, we'll come back to that in a bit. But you know, this is an interesting story. It's a little bit troubling to us. Here Joshua, who is leading the nation of Israel, Moses has died. Joshua, who had been his right-hand man, now kind of takes the lead at God's command to lead Israel into the land of Canaan. Finally, after 40 years of wandering, Joshua's leading them in. And so they're sitting opposite of this great city, Jericho. And he sends in these spies. And they go to a prostitute's house. Isn't that interesting that these men of God would go to a prostitute's house? You know, there are some commentators that make the argument, they make the case that the word for harlot here is sometimes used for innkeeper. Because oftentimes in antiquity, you know, you didn't have Motel 6. Bob Modell was not there. And so oftentimes hotels were run as kind of brothels as well. And so a lot of people say, well, she wasn't really a harlot. She wasn't really a prostitute. She was running a hotel. You know, there's a couple problems with that. The book of Hebrews, the book of James make reference to Rahab. And they use the Greek word to describe her, porne, which is the Greek word for prostitute. So the inspired writers of the New Testament look back at the story and they say, no, she was a prostitute. Now, it's very possible that her house was also a hotel. Now, I want you to think about Jericho for a second. Jericho was a major city on a trade route. People coming from all around would pass by Jericho, coming from Mesopotamia, coming from what would later be Babylon. That region would come into Palestine, or what we call Palestine today, maybe, or that region of the world, and they would enter that region by coming through Jericho. It was a major trade city. If you're a spy and people are looking for you in antiquity, can't you imagine that cover story of we're staying at this place because that's where a lot of travelers would stay? I don't know what those guys were doing there. It said that they were lodging there. It says that they were sleeping there. But whatever the case, this is where they stayed. They stayed at a house or perhaps a hotel, an inn kept by a woman that was a prostitute. And some commentators do try to make the case, you know, she was just an innkeeper. Why do we do that? We have a hard time justifying that in our minds. But you see, I think we do a little bit of a damage to the story when we try to justify things that way. You see, this was a woman whose life was full of sin. I don't know why she was a prostitute. I don't know why she was a harlot. Was that something that she was forced into? Was she trafficked in that situation? Was her family so poor that that was her only choice? You know, there's zero in the context that tells us that. She references her father's household. So her father was in town. He had an extended family. But you see, this was a woman that everyone would have looked at and said, what is her worth? What kind of a woman is this? But what else do we know about this woman? We notice this woman is someone who, when she's talking to the spies, she says, everyone has heard about this God of Israel. She calls him by name. Did you notice that in the text? It says Lord, and all the letters are capitalized. She calls him Yahweh. We've all heard about Yahweh. We've heard what he did to the Egyptians. I want you to weigh that on your minds for just a second. She said, we've heard what he did to Egypt. That was 40 years ago. Because remember, Israel's been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. She's calling back something that happened 40 years ago. She's thinking about this migration of people that started 40 years ago. She's worried about them coming into the land. I recently watched a documentary on Sitting Bull on Netflix. It was kind of interesting to me. I know I'm switching historical gears on you here. But you know, Sitting Bull was concerned about all the settlers coming from the eastern United States into Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, all those states. You know, that didn't happen overnight. That happened over decades. But Sitting Bull and all those Sioux Indians were concerned about that migration. Well, in the same way, here's Rahab and the people of Jericho, and they're concerned about that migration of Israelites. But you see, she doesn't just tell them, you know, we're concerned about the mass of folks that you guys are bringing into the land. That's not what she says. She says, we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea, and what you did to the two kings. We have heard, and our hearts melted, and no courage remained because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. You see, the ancients believed that there were deities, there were spiritual powers that controlled every aspect of the cosmos, every aspect of life, every aspect of the natural world. But you see, there might be one God that controlled the sea, and there might be another God that controlled the weather. There might be another God that controlled different aspects of life, and they had their little dominion. But your God, she says, Yahweh, is God of everything. In other words, this woman that was a prostitute that everyone else in society looked down on and probably held in contempt and hatred and thought she was the scum of the world, this woman says, this is what I believe about your God. And so the spies get ready to leave. And she says, promise me that when you come in and destroy this place. You see, there's no doubt in her mind. As she's thinking about these spies, they're going to accomplish whatever they intend to accomplish because God is on their side. She knows what's going to happen. There's no doubt in her mind. And so she says, when you guys come in, spare me. They say, okay, we'll spare you. Just tie this red thread, this red cord in your window. What is that going to do? They say, make sure that everyone in your family that you want to have saved is in your house with you when we come in. But what is this silly little red thread got to do with it? How is that going to help us? We come to Joshua chapter 6. And the second part of this story, you got to wonder what people were thinking. Notice what happens. Joshua chapter 6, verse 1. It says, now Jericho was tightly shut because of the sons of Israel. No one went out and no one came in. The Lord said to Joshua, see, I've given Jericho into your hand with its king and its valiant warriors. If we just pause it for just a second, don't you think Joshua's thinking, well, that's good stuff. I mean, God, just make it happen. God, destroy the city. God, give us victory as we war against this city. I imagine that if I was in Joshua's shoes, I would be thinking of some great military victory in which our soldiers, were just prolific, and the enemy could do nothing to stop them. But that's not what God says. Notice what the text says. Verse 3, God tells Joshua, he says, you shall march around the city. That's what every soldier is excited about, is marching, right? March around the city, circling the city once. You shall do this for 6 days. Also, priests shall carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. And then on the 7th day, you shall march around the city 7 times. and the priests shall blow the trumpets. At that point, I'm wondering, what's Joshua thinking? Wait a minute, let me get this right, God. Your plan is that we're going to march around the city for 6 days. And then on the 7th day, we're going to march around the city 7 times, and we're going to blow some trumpets. Now, that doesn't sound like a very good strategic plan to me. How's that going to help us take the city? Don't you see there'd be lots of ways for Joshua to think in his mind, this doesn't make any sense to me. But God doesn't stop there. Verse 5, God says, it shall be that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpets, and all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people will go up every man straight ahead. You're telling me we're going to walk around the city for 6 days. And on the 7th day, we're going to walk around the city for 7 times. And we're going to blow some trumpets and the walls are just going to fall down? God, I don't get it. And then we're going to rush in there and take the city. You know, there are modern scholars that look at this story. And they speculate. They say, well, you know, this is kind of interesting. That when people march in cadence, and remember the sons of Israel, the armies of Israel, we're talking about several tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people, marching around and say, when they all march and they put their foot down at the same time, that maybe that does something to the structure of that building. And when they do that on the 7th day, and they do that 7 times, that maybe that cadence provides such a vibration that it really does something to the structure of the walls. You see, they're looking for a naturalistic explanation for why that would have brought the walls of the city down. And you know, I have no problem with God using a natural means to cause something to happen. But I'm just wondering why no one else in ancient history used this technique if it was so effective. God's doing something unique here with Jericho. But you see, God tells Joshua, here's how you're going to do this. And I can just imagine Joshua thinking in his mind, this doesn't make any sense to me. Or at least the possibility that Joshua would think that. But that's Joshua. Now, God tells him on the 7th day, here's what you're going to do. The trumpets are going to blast, and you're going to rush in as the walls fall. But notice what Joshua tells the people. Look at verse 6. So Joshua, the son of Nun, called the priests and said to them, take up the ark of the covenant, and let the 7 priests carry the 7 trumpets of the ram's horn before the ark of the Lord. Verse 7, then he said to the people, go forward, march around the city, let the armed men go on before the ark of the Lord. And so it was, when Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of the ram's horns before the Lord went forward and blew the trumpets, and the ark of the covenant of the Lord followed them. The armed men, verse 9, went before the priest who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard came up after the ark while they continued to blow the trumpets. But Joshua commanded the people, saying, you shall not shout, nor let your voice be heard, nor let a word proceed out of your mouth until the day I tell you to shout. Then you shall shout. Do you notice what's missing here? God told Joshua, you're going to march around this thing for 6 days. 1 time a day. On the 7th day, you're going to march around the city 7 times, and the walls are going to fall down. Joshua gets the complete picture, but did you notice what Joshua tells the people? We're going to march. For 7 days, we're going to march. And you're not going to say a word. He leaves out the part about the fact that God's going to bring the walls down on the 7th day. They don't even get that picture. Can you imagine being one of those people of Israel? They don't know what the plan is. All they know is that Joshua told them, we're going to march. Can you imagine anyone? Do you think anyone in the people of Israel, when they heard that plan, said, this is stupid? What's Joshua thinking? Do you think God's really talking to Joshua, or is he just kind of making this up on the fly? Now, the text doesn't say anyone thought that, but I've got to imagine that in all those tens of thousands of people, at least one person had that thought. But you see, God did have a plan. And sometimes in our lives, we look at what we see in Scripture about God's plan for us, and it would be so easy for us to say, this is kind of dumb. Now, I doubt any of us would look at God and say, I think your plan's kind of dumb, but I wonder how often we're tempted as human beings to think, I don't get it. Is this really what God wants me to do? Is this really going to work? But you see, Israel obeyed Joshua, and they obeyed God, and Joshua obeyed God, and they march around the city 6 days, just like God tells them to do. They march around the city 7 times on the 7th day, just like God tells them to do. When God tells Joshua, blow the trumpets, Joshua tells the priests to blow the trumpets. They blow the trumpets. The people shout when Joshua tells them to shout, and they shout, and the walls fall down. They take the city, and there is Rahab with that silly red cord hanging in her window. And everyone in her house is saved. How did that work? I don't know. But you see, she trusted God, she followed his instructions, and she was saved. Her and everyone in her household that was in her house. The people of Israel were able to run in and take this major city on a major trade route without having to do any real battle. All by the power of God. And sometimes in our lives, when we have doubt about what God's plan is, we can look back at this story. We can ask ourselves, how is it that me going down under some water for a split second and being brought back up is going to save my spiritual life? That is so ridiculous. God says, that's my plan. But I want you to think about Rahab. Because Rahab is a prostitute. Her life is full of sin. And the story continues for Rahab here in Joshua chapter 6. We're told that she becomes a part of the people of Israel. But you know what else? Matthew chapter 1, the genealogy of Jesus, we find out that Rahab married a man named Salmon, who became the father of Boaz. Boaz becomes the father of Jesse. Jesse becomes the father of King David. And Jesus, the Messiah, is the descendant of David. That means Jesus has a prostitute as one of the matriarchs in his family. This prostitute became someone through whom the Messiah came. And sometimes as I look at my life, or sometimes as you look at your life, or sometimes as people in life, they look at the sins in their life and they think to themselves, there is no way someone like me can receive God's forgiveness. God says, I'm going to see your forgiveness and raise you one. Because not only am I saving Rahab's life, but I'm going to use her to bring my son into the world. And sometimes I can look back at my life, or you can look back at your life, or others can look back at their lives and they can see the mess, and I can't see any way of how that's going to fix anything. It's almost like your dad saying, jump out of the car when I tell you to and push that back end up in the snow. I don't think that's going to work. God says, I'm better than a Ford Torino. I can save your soul. Be united with my son in his death, burial, and resurrection through baptism. Change the way you think. Become my disciple. Follow me. And you'll follow me into my house. So many times as we look at Scripture, we may be tempted to think, you know what, that doesn't make sense to me. Why did God do things this way? Why does God tell us to worship this way? But the reality is, God's wisdom is there to lead us into a right relationship and to make that connection one that is spiritually sound and strong. It connects us to our reliance on Him. You see, Rahab being told, put this yellow or this red cord out in your window, is tying her reliance on God, her trust on God. Joshua, listening to God say, walk around this city 7 times, is building his trust, his confidence, his reliance on God. And helping us know when God says, I'm going to make it happen, it happens. Because there is no reason why a red cord saves your house from being blown down when everything else around you is blown down, except God's power. Folks, God can change your life. God can help your life be brand new. God can save your soul when we trust in Him and know He's the only thing that can make it happen. Are you here this morning and you need to trust Jesus that way? Are you here this morning and you need to recognize God's awesome power to save your soul and to change your life? You can do that by being united with Jesus in His death, burial, and resurrection through baptism. Maybe you're here this morning. There are other things in your life that you want the church to be praying about, that you want the church to be aware of, to be concerned about. Whatever your need, won't you come? As together we stand and sing.